While My Guitar Gently Weeps is one of the most widely beloved Beatles songs. Written by George Harrison, it is perhaps most well known for being the only Beatles track to feature a guest guitarist, George's friend Eric Clapton, who stepped in to record an uncredited solo that ranks as one of the most riveting moments on the White Album. But that's not what this episode is about. Instead, we're going to explore a mystery that has perplexed Beatles fans and scholars alike for decades. First, I'm going to point out the mystery, then present evidence from various sources, and attempt to solve it. And, as a fair warning, once I point it out, you can't unhear this. The central mystery in While My Guitar Gently Weeps is about something that normally isn't a source of controversy in most Beatles songs. Who is playing bass? On the vast majority of Beatles songs, the answer to that question is Paul McCartney, in a role that dates back to their earliest days playing in clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg. But some fans believe that a rare exception occurred on this song, and that the bass was in fact played by another Beatle. And no, not Ringo. In order to get to the meat of this mystery, let's first step back to the origins of the song and trace the rather convoluted history of this very special composition. In early 1968, the Beatles were facing burnout, both from the highs of their epic Sgt. Pepper project and from the lows of the tragic death of their manager, Brian Epstein. In a much-needed respite, the band and their partners traded the pressures of a studio in England for an ashram in India, inspired in large part by George Harrison's deepening interest in Indian culture and Eastern philosophy. Although each of the band members ultimately had very different feelings about the quality of the trip, the change of scenery did seem to spawn a fresh creative energy in its wake that the band harnessed in the form of song demos that would eventually take shape as the White Album. Among these demos was a beautiful new ballad by George Harrison, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. On July 25, 1968, George recorded a sparse acoustic version of the song at EMI Studios. A few weeks later, on August 16th, the full band convened to run through the song with George on guitar, Paul on bass, Ringo on drums, and John playing an organ. After running through 14 takes, they did a quick mix of the track and shelved it for a few more weeks while George went on vacation. The version we're familiar with today was started on September 5th, 1968. But in the few weeks since recording the August version, a number of major events had taken place that would influence this recording dramatically. Firstly, Ringo had announced to the group that he was taking an extended hiatus from the band, out of what he called a moment of turmoil, and feeling like an outsider among the three other Beatles. Soon realizing the weight of Ringo's absence, the band dispatched an apologetic telegram, encouraging him to come back from his self-imposed exile in the Mediterranean, and promising that things would be better. And so he did, a few days later, returning to EMI Studios, welcomed with flowers adorning his drum kit. With the quartet reunited once again, While My Guitar Gently Weeps would be the very first song that the restored Beatles would tackle, and the quality of the performances on the new September version seemed to reflect that renewed spirit. The second major development had to do with equipment. Up to this point, the Beatles had primarily worked with 4-track tape recorders, which, as the name suggests, only allowed for 4 independent channels of audio to be recorded onto a single tape. That meant that multiple instruments often had to be combined onto a single track in order to make room for more complex arrangements and additions that the Beatles were increasingly fond of using. This often required compromises, and a fair degree of studio engineering magic on the part of EMI engineers to pull off. But the band had experimented with state-of-the-art 8-track recorders at other studios nearby, and this had piqued their interest in getting one set up at their home at EMI. While Ringo was gone, the band had stumbled upon a brand new 8-track recorder in a nearby room and requested that it be set up for their use immediately. At this point, when the Beatles asked for something, they got it. The band saw this technological leap as a creative boon, enticing them to add even more layers of instruments and sounds to their compositions. Equipped with this new setup, George had the tapes from the August sessions copied over to the new 8-track machine to continue work on it. But after a bit of late-night experimenting with ideas like a backwards guitar solo, George decided to abandon work on the prior version entirely and start from scratch. For this new version, he had brought a secret weapon. His close friend Eric Clapton, invited by George to the studio to contribute an extremely rare guest guitar part. With Eric Clapton on electric guitar, George on acoustic guitar, Ringo on drums, Paul on piano, and John most likely on organ, the group worked their way through more than 20 takes, eventually settling on take 25 as the winner for the backing track. A fun little tidbit, during downtime in this session, Paul ran through a primitive version of a song that wouldn't be released for another year and a half.
Whispering words of wisdom, let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be.
Incidentally, this same snippet also confirms that Eric Clapton was indeed there, despite receiving no credit on the final album sleeve.
Cans on Eric.
But back to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which was finally taking shape. With everyone's hands already occupied with various instruments during the recording of the backing track, the bass part, normally played by Paul, who instead was on piano here, would have to be added later on. On the next day, September 6th, the band reconvened to finish the track by adding more vocals, additional percussion, and the bass part. So here's where we get to the mystery. Let's first listen to the isolated bass track to hear if we can identify what's happening. During the verses of the song, it sounds like there's one bass guitar, alternating between single notes and power chords. What is clear is that this is a much heavier sound than on most Beatles songs. And the band was clearly fond of it during this period, using it for a few other White Album tracks recorded in August and September 1968, such as Back in the USSR, Helter Skelter, and Glass Onion. And frankly, it's awesome. The default answer to the question of who is playing bass is, as any Beatles fan knows, Paul. Not surprisingly then, many Beatles websites credit Paul with the part here. But here's where things get weird. Giles Martin, son of legendary Beatles producer George Martin, made a rather stunning claim in a 2018 interview with NPR.
John was, he played the bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. For the final take, yeah, there's a sort of chugging, there's a ding, 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 which is a 6-string bit. Paul is playing piano and organ and singing.
This claim was echoed in the extensive liner notes included with the 2018 White Album Deluxe Edition, a breathtaking project that Giles oversaw. For some fans, this alleged revelation was a major shock. First off, could John even play a bass part? Well, yes, but with an important caveat. If this were John playing, he likely wouldn't have been playing a typical 4-string bass guitar, but instead something called a Fender 6, which is a hybrid instrument that looks like a standard 6-string guitar, but is tuned to a lower octave to make it sound more in the range of a bass guitar. That means that a guitar player like John or George could easily pick up this instrument and add a fairly convincing bass accompaniment to a song. The Beatles in fact owned a Fender 6, which incidentally made a public appearance right before this session, in George's hands during the filming of the Hey Jude promotional video on September the 4th. There are also photos of John holding it around this period, so clearly both Beatle guitarists had some interest in it. So Giles' 2018 revelation about John could be true, but the mystery doesn't end there. During the bridge sections of the song, something else gets added in. At least one other instrument comes in to mimic the bass line. This gets a little buried in the final mix, but if we isolate it, it's a lot clearer. Ken Scott, who was the young, aspiring studio engineer at EMI during those recording sessions for While My Guitar Gently Weeps, recalled in his 2012 memoir that the 4-string bass was sometimes doubled by a 6-string bass on some songs, By this time, Paul had acquired a Fender jazz bass, which he used in lieu of his Rickenbacker. And a Fender Bass 6 was always around the studio. You hear it on Piggies, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Glass Onion, and Rocky Raccoon. The two parts were always played together and never overdubbed individually. Scott suggested that the band, now equipped with the extra flexibility of the 8-track recorder, may have been inspired to copy a similar style from the music of Bert Kaempfert, a German composer and record producer who had befriended the band in the early 1960s and in fact played a major role in bringing the Beatles into the spotlight, signing their first official recording contract. You can hear a similar doubling of the bass line in some of his work. Funnily enough, a few years later, John complained about this type of bass sound during the sessions for his Imagine solo album.
Bass sounds too trebly. It sounds like Bert Kaempfert again.
This style was also popular in early American country western records, where it was referred to as tic-tac style. Adopting this special style here fits with their overall approach during the White Album of incorporating references and nods to nearly all genres of music in some form or another. But back to the question at hand. Ken Scott's account seems to suggest that Paul had to have been playing here, and that someone else, John, George, or possibly both of them, joined during the bridge part to emulate the tic-tac sound. This bridge part is even referenced in the fantastic miniseries McCartney 3-2-1.
Very aggressive sound, isn't it? Doesn't even sound like a bass.
Unfortunately, the mystery of who is actually playing these parts is never addressed. It seems that nearly every Beatles website, fan forum contributor, and Reddit commenter has a slightly different take on what actually happened during that session. So while we don't have a definitive answer from Paul himself, we do know based on Ken Scott's recollection that at least 2 Beatles were playing this part at some point, calling into question many of the unofficial accounts of this session. Perhaps Giles is right, and this was John taking the helm on the Fender 6 bass throughout, a role that he would allegedly take up again less than a week later during the sessions for Helter Skelter. A topic that I'll save for another episode. But short of definitive proof, this mystery may be left up to you to decide. What do you think is the most accurate lineup here? Let me know in the comments. All mysteries aside, While My Guitar Gently Weeps is a hauntingly beautiful ballad with layers of diverse yet complementary musical ideas that transport you to another place entirely during its 5-minute journey. The song, for good reason, is more than just a beloved fan favorite. It's also one of the most highly appreciated Beatles songs by other musicians, inspiring countless live performances, including one of the most memorable live solos of all time, performed by Prince in 2004 at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Aside from the technical milestone of it being the first Beatles song to take advantage of EMI's 8-track recorder, and aside from featuring the first and only guest guitarist on any Beatles recording, While My Guitar Gently Weeps represents something even more significant in the Beatles' story. The moment when George Harrison established himself as a songwriter on par with the Lennon-McCartney machine, paving the way for subsequent Beatles masterpieces like Here Comes the Sun and Something, and also previewing the pent-up talent that would come pouring out a few years later across George's solo epic All Things Must Pass. And although we lost George far too soon, he left an indelible impact through songs like these on his fellow Beatles, on the music world, and on us, the fans. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please share and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. As always, thanks for watching.